It was a spring morning in New York City, and a 6-year-old boy vanished between his front door and the corner bus stop. No one saw him leave. No one saw him arrive. For decades, the question echoed through the streets of SoHo. What happened to Etan Patz? This is the story that would not let go. The city was waking up, but it was still carrying that muted hum of early morning. In SoHo, 1979, the streets had a certain stillness. Loft buildings standing like sentinels, iron fire escapes tracing patterns down brick facades, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery on the corner. On this particular Friday, the air felt unsettled. Inside a modest third-floor loft on Prince Street, 6-year-old Etan Patz was lacing up his sneakers, blue with a bright green stripe, ready for what he considered a milestone. Today, for the first time, he was going to walk to the bus stop on his own. Just 2 blocks. To any adult, it might have seemed trivial. But for Etan, it was a moment of independence he had begged for all year. His parents, Stan and Julie Patz, had wrestled with the decision. The neighborhood wasn't exactly teeming with kids. SoHo in those days was a mix of artists' lofts and gritty industrial spaces, but it felt like home. Everyone seemed to know everyone, and 2 blocks in broad daylight didn't feel dangerous. At least, that's what they told themselves. Etan grabbed his blue cloth lunch bag with white elephants printed on it. In his hand, he clutched a single $1, his pay from helping a neighborhood handyman the day before. He planned to stop at the corner bodega and buy a soda for lunch. Before he left, his mother kissed him goodbye, reminded him to come straight home after school, and watched as he walked toward the corner. She didn't know it at the time, but that was the last moment she would ever see her son. 8 o'clock came and went. The school bus arrived at its usual stop, but Etan never got on. When he didn't return home that afternoon, the initial concern was tempered by logic. Maybe the bus was delayed. Maybe he stopped at a friend's house. But as minutes became hours, logic gave way to panic. Calls were made. Neighbors checked in. No one had seen him. By late afternoon, the New York Police Department had been notified. At first, the response was procedural questions about custody disputes, runaway possibilities. But once it was confirmed that Etan hadn't been at school at all, everything changed. By nightfall, Prince Street was flooded with police officers. Searchlights lit the wet pavement. Detectives knocked on doors, swept through basements, climbed to rooftops. Helicopters circled overhead, their beams slicing through the mist. Volunteers canvassed the neighborhood, asking shop owners if they'd seen a small blonde boy with a pilot's cap and a wide, eager smile. But the hours kept passing, and the boy at the center of it all seemed to have vanished into thin air. In the years that followed, Etan Patz's disappearance would not just haunt his family. It would change how America thought about missing children. This was the beginning of a case that would stretch across decades, across state lines, and across the blurred edges of memory and obsession. And it all started with a simple walk to the bus stop. By the time the evening rain began to fall, the search for Etan Patz had already transformed Prince Street into something that looked more like a command post than a residential block. Police cruisers lined the curb, their doors open, headlights aimed down the street to cut through the dark. Uniformed officers moved in pairs, knocking on doors, asking the same urgent questions. In the Patz loft, the phone rang endlessly. Stan and Julie sat near the work table, flanked by detectives scribbling down names. Friends, acquaintances, anyone who might have known Etan's routines. Every now and then, Julie's eyes would drift toward the large windows that overlooked the street, as if she could will her son to appear out of the shadows. 300 officers were mobilized that night. It wasn't just about manpower, it was about speed. The longer a child was missing, the harder it became to find them alive. The first 24 hours were critical, and everyone on the street knew it. Bloodhounds were brought in from upstate. The dogs sniffed Etan's pajamas, tails twitching, then surged forward, down the block toward the bus stop, then back toward home. Their sudden reversal stirred a chilling theory. Maybe Etan had missed the bus and tried to return, only to be intercepted before he could reach the door. Volunteers joined in, combing the streets with flashlights. They peered into alleys, down basement steps, behind dumpsters. flyers began to appear, hastily sketched likenesses of a small boy in a pilot's cap, photocopied in black and white, taped to lampposts and storefronts. But as the hours wore on, so did the questions. Could someone from the neighborhood have taken him? SoHo was a place where everyone knew each other's faces, but it wasn't a closed world. Delivery drivers, handymen, passers-by. There were plenty of strangers moving in and out of the area every day. Inside the loft, Stan retreated to his darkroom. Photography was his profession, but now it was also his weapon. He printed sheet after sheet of Etan's portrait, clear, professional images that captured the sparkle in his eyes, the kind of photos that made strangers feel like they knew him. Those pictures would soon appear on posters across the city, in multiple languages, reaching corners of New York that had never even heard of SoHo. Meanwhile, a new presence began to arrive on Prince Street. The press. Television trucks pulled up, reporters carrying microphones and notepads. Cameras pointed toward the Patz loft, eager to capture the human side of the story. Some detectives welcomed the coverage, believing it could reach someone who had seen something. Others worried about too much exposure too soon. But for Stan and Julie, the choice had already been made. Privacy no longer mattered. Every stranger on the street was now a potential lead, a possible clue. If showing Etan's face to the world could bring him home, then every camera, every headline, every news broadcast was worth it. As Sunday approached, the city's attention began to shift. Churches mentioned Etan's name from the pulpit. Transit workers announced his description over the radio every half hour. And in SoHo, the search continued, door to door, block to block. Every knock and every question echoing the same desperate hope. Someone somewhere had to know where Etan Patz was. By Sunday morning, the search for Etan Patz had become more than a police operation. It was a neighborhood occupation. The narrow streets of SoHo echoed with the sound of boots on pavement, the murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a police dog straining at the leash. Inside the loft, Stan and Julie existed in a strange suspension of time. Days and nights bled into each other. Sleep, if it came at all, arrived in short, restless bursts, cut off by the shrill ring of the phone or the knock of an officer at the door. Each time they braced themselves for news, but it was always another question, another request for details they had already given. The media presence had grown into a constant background hum. Camera crews waited outside, ready to capture any development, no matter how small. Reporters leaned on door frames with notepads in hand, their eyes darting between the parents and the detectives, looking for a hint of emotion, a fragment of a quote that could lead the evening news. One of the first promising calls came from the hardware store on Spring Street. The manager swore he had seen two boys playing in the lumber yard the previous afternoon. One of them, he said, looked exactly like the boy in the flyers. They had even bought a box of nails. Detectives rushed to check the lead. Within hours, it unraveled. The boys were identified, and neither was Etan. Another door closed. It was the same story again and again. A child matching the description spotted at a playground. False alarm. A neighbor certain she had seen him walking with a man near the river. Mistaken identity. Each tip lifted hopes, then dropped them harder than before. By late Sunday, the flyers were everywhere. Etan's face looked out from bodega windows, coffee shop doors, subway entrances. The picture wasn't a grainy snapshot, but a sharp, professional portrait taken by his father. A detail that made it harder to look away. His eyes, wide and bright, seemed to ask the city for help. The pressure on the detectives was relentless. Holidays didn't matter. In missing child cases, every hour counted. But the Memorial Day weekend had turned parts of the city into ghost streets. Shops were closed, warehouses locked, many residents out of town. Access was difficult, and every closed door felt like a missed opportunity. In the loft, volunteers brought food the family couldn't eat. Friends came to sit in silence, unsure of what to say. The phone logs began to fill, names, numbers, and cryptic notes about the caller's information. Some were heartfelt offers of help. Others were cruel hoaxes or rambling messages from self-proclaimed psychics. Julie moved between the couch, the balcony, and the phone table, smoking constantly, watching the street. Stan buried himself in the work of printing more photos. It gave his hands something to do, a small act of control in a situation where control had vanished. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the streetlights and the posters and the broadcast bulletins, was the unanswered question no one could silence. Where was Etan? By Monday morning, Soho no longer felt like Soho. The long holiday weekend was ending, and people were returning to the city to find a neighborhood transformed. Prince Street, usually a mix of quiet loft entrances and the occasional delivery truck, was now a staging ground. Uniformed officers leaned over maps on folding tables. Detectives in plain clothes clustered in the corners of cafes, comparing notes. The hum of police radios was constant. The flyers had done their work. Etan Patz was now a name beyond the block, beyond Lower Manhattan. Radio stations were reciting his description. Evening news anchors, their voices steady but grave, repeated the same list of details. 6 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, black pilot's cap, blue corduroy jacket, blue pants, blue sneakers with fluorescent stripes, carrying a blue cloth bag with white elephants. For many New Yorkers, it was an unusually specific image, easy to visualize. That made it harder to forget. The NYPD began widening the search radius, street by street. By now, the FBI had joined in. Not because the case had crossed state lines, but because the disappearance of a child without witnesses was a situation where every possible resource counted. They brought expertise in victimology, experience in abduction cases, and another layer of pressure to find something, anything, that could explain what had happened in those missing minutes between Etan leaving home and the bus arriving without him. Canvases extended into neighboring districts. Officers searched rooftops and alleyways, abandoned lots, and basement boiler rooms. In some cases, they had to break locks with the reluctant permission of absentee landlords. Search teams scoured the edges of the Hudson River, knowing that if the boy had been harmed, the current could carry evidence away faster than the investigation could move. Inside the loft, the phone log grew thicker. The calls came in waves. Neighbors remembering something they had seen. Parents from other boroughs offering to put up posters. Strangers calling simply to say they were praying. Each one was noted, no matter how far-fetched or improbable. The press, sensing the public's growing interest, doubled down. Newscasts ran not only the latest updates but also background pieces on the Patz family, on SoHo, on the changing face of New York. Newspapers began to describe the case in terms that suggested something larger. A cautionary tale about the vulnerability of children in a city that was learning to see itself differently. By the middle of the week, the missing person flyers had crossed the East River into Brooklyn, spread into Queens, even appeared in parts of New Jersey. The portrait of Etan, clear, almost luminous, stared out from bus shelters, subway kiosks, laundromat bulletin boards. The city was watching. The nation was beginning to, but for all the attention, there was still no break, no confirmed sighting, no solid lead. Just the same unbearable questions, asked over and over, in the hope that someone's answer might be different this time. And at the center of it all, two parents who had not yet allowed themselves to speak the thought that hovered like a shadow behind every word. What if Etan wasn't coming back? The first days after Etan vanished had been a blur of adrenaline. Search teams moved with urgency. Neighbors taped flyers to every reachable surface. Reporters pressed for sound bites. But as the second week began, something in the air shifted. The search was no less intense, but the energy was different. The shock that had propelled people forward was giving way to something heavier. The slow, exhausting grind of unanswered questions. Police headquarters on Prince Street still buzzed with activity, but now the detectives' conversations were quieter, more clipped. The early flood of leads had thinned, and the ones that did come in were often recycled. The same, "I thought I saw him" stories, the same vague descriptions of a boy who turned out not to be Etan. Each dead end was another weight on the case. For Stan and Julie, days no longer had a clear beginning or end. The loft had become a revolving door of officers, volunteers, neighbors, and journalists. At any hour, someone was knocking, calling, or stepping in to update them on a search area, to ask another question, or to drop off food they couldn't bring themselves to eat. Stan retreated more often into his darkroom. the red glow reflecting off his glasses as he printed more photos. The repetition was deliberate. Printing gave him the illusion of progress. Julie moved between pacing and stillness, smoking as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The phone continued to ring. Some calls offered possible sightings. Others came from people claiming to have visions or messages from the beyond. Detectives took down everything, no matter how implausible, because they couldn't risk missing something real. But with each strange call, the line between genuine help and distraction blurred. Meanwhile, the media's attention was deepening. Newspapers began running larger pieces, not just on the search itself, but on the broader issue of child safety in urban America. Commentators debated how children should navigate a city like New York, whether walking to school alone was a rite of passage or an unacceptable risk. Parents were suddenly rethinking routines they'd taken for granted. In SoHo, the flyers were fading under the weather, their edges curling from the damp. Volunteers replaced them, keeping Etan's image fresh. But with every new poster taped over an old one, the unspoken truth hung heavier. The boy in the picture had now been gone for more than a week. At night, when the cameras were gone and the noise of the street died down, Stan and Julie faced the quiet together. It was in those hours that the fear pressed in hardest, not from what was known, but from everything that wasn't. They still couldn't bring themselves to say it out loud. But the thought was there, shared in glances and in the long pauses between words. If Etan was alive, why hadn't he been found yet? By the start of the third week, the Patz case was no longer just a neighborhood crisis. It had grown into something larger, a test of the city's ability to respond to a disappearance that didn't fit the usual patterns. The NYPD had exhausted the first wave of door-to-door canvassing. Every building within a wide radius of Prince Street had been checked, sometimes twice. Basements had been entered, rooftops swept, storage rooms opened. The police dogs had done their work. The riverbanks had been searched again and again, and still nothing. The strategy now turned inward to interviews, re-interviews, and psychological profiling. Detectives sat down with everyone who might have crossed Etan's path. Shopkeepers, delivery drivers, neighbors who barely knew the Patzes, even passing strangers who had been in the area that morning. In each case, they watched body language as closely as they listened to words. It was tedious work, and it required a different kind of stamina. Gone were the high-adrenaline search teams sweeping the streets. Now the investigation moved at the pace of conversation and paperwork. It wasn't as visible to the public, but the detectives knew it was just as critical. The FBI's involvement deepened. Agents worked alongside NYPD officers to build a profile of the kind of person who might target a child like Etan. They considered the geography of the disappearance, a short walk to a familiar bus stop, in an area where most people knew each other, and weighed what that suggested about the abductor's familiarity with the neighborhood. In the loft, Stan and Julie remained in the strange half-life of people who can't stop moving but have nowhere to go. They continued speaking with reporters, not because they wanted to, but because keeping Etan's face in the public eye was one of the few tools left. Meanwhile, the case was starting to ripple outward in ways that no one could yet measure. Advocacy groups, some local, some national, were taking notice. Parents' organizations began talking about the lack of a centralized system for missing child alerts. Legal experts pointed out that there was no standardized way for law enforcement agencies to share information across state lines. A few voices even began suggesting that Etan's disappearance could, and should lead to lasting changes in how the country thinks about child safety. No one knew it then, but those conversations were planting the first seeds of what would eventually become national initiatives. Amber Alerts, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the idea that a child's face could be as familiar on a milk carton as it was in a family photo album. But for Stan and Julie, all of that was abstract. Their focus was still painfully immediate. Every day without answers was another day Etan was gone. And every night, when the last detective left and the phone finally stopped ringing, the same thought returned. Heavy, unrelenting, impossible to silence. Where was their son? The investigation had reached the point where detectives could no longer avoid the uncomfortable questions. Not just about strangers, but about the people who lived and worked close to the Patz family. The reality was harsh. In most child abductions, The perpetrator is not a masked figure lurking in a dark alley, but someone with some connection to the victim. That didn't mean it was a neighbor or a friend, but it did mean that no one could be ruled out without scrutiny. Detectives began quietly looking at the personal histories of those who had been in Etan's orbit. They mapped the comings and goings of residents in the days before and after May 25th. They checked alibis, verifying travel plans, interviewing relatives and coworkers. In a city as dense and transient as New York, even a single floor of a building could hold stories no one had bothered to tell before. For the Patzes, the shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Questions about their marriage, their finances, their discipline of the children, things asked in the first hours as a matter of routine, were now being revisited, sometimes with more persistence. The detectives weren't accusing them, but the implication hung in the air. In the absence of a clear suspect, everyone was under the microscope. Meanwhile, the press coverage was evolving. The first wave of stories had been urgent appeals, Etan's face alongside headlines asking the public to help. Now, as the case stretched past the initial weeks, the tone began to fracture. Some outlets stayed focused on keeping the boy's image alive. Others started chasing angles that could pull in more readers. Speculation about possible suspects, rumors about the family, even criticism of the decision to let Etan walk to the bus stop alone. The Patzes had to navigate this minefield carefully. They needed the exposure, but they also needed the story to stay truthful. A distorted headline could help spread Etan's image, but it could also plant seeds of suspicion that would be hard to uproot. Behind the scenes, detectives were also fielding a steady stream of tips from outside New York. With the story now reaching other states, calls came in about sightings as far away as Florida, Texas, and California. Each had to be logged and evaluated. Most were dismissed quickly. A child at a gas station who looked vaguely similar, a boy in a park wearing a blue cap, but they still consumed time and manpower. And yet, there were moments when the investigation's intensity sparked hope. A man stopped on the street for questioning might match a witness description. A car spotted near the bus stop that morning might be traced. Each time, the possibility of a breakthrough brought a flicker of life back into the search. But the flicker never became a flame. Leads fizzled. Witnesses retracted details. Descriptions blurred under repeated questioning. And as the summer of 1979 began to unfold, one thing was becoming painfully clear. This was not going to be a quick recovery. The Patz case was moving into dangerous territory, the kind where time isn't just the enemy, it's a thief, slowly stealing memory, urgency, and, for some, hope. Summer in New York can feel relentless. The heavy air, the glare off brick and pavement, the way sound seems to hang between the buildings. By July of 1979, that heat pressed down on SoHo like an extra weight, and for the Patz family, it was another layer on top of a burden that hadn't lifted since May 25th. The initial flood of activity had thinned into a steady trickle. Detectives still came by, but the urgency in their voices had softened into routine check-ins. The search wasn't over, but it was no longer a sprint. Now it was a long, grinding marathon, and no one could say where the finish line might be. In the loft, Stan and Julie began to navigate two separate worlds. In public, they were the faces of the case, willing to speak to reporters, to pose for photographs, to attend events that kept Etan's name alive. They understood the cruel truth. Without constant visibility, public attention would drift, and with it, the chance of finding their son. In private, the strain was harder to disguise. Friends noticed the way Stan's conversations sometimes trailed off mid-sentence, his mind clearly somewhere else. Julie's chain smoking intensified. The ashtrays in the loft filled and refilled, evidence of restless hours. They were still partners in the search, but grief and uncertainty have a way of isolating even the closest bonds. The neighborhood's mood had changed too. In those first days, the search for Etan had been a unifying force. Strangers had worked side by side, stapling flyers, scanning the streets. But as the weeks turned into months, reality set in. Parents kept their children closer. Casual sidewalk conversations gave way to wary glances. The idea that a child could vanish in broad daylight had taken root, and it wasn't letting go. Leads continued to arrive, but fewer of them carried real weight. A boy seen boarding a bus in another state. A child matching the description spotted in the company of an older man at a shopping mall. Each tip was checked. Each came to nothing. Some calls were cruel hoaxes, people who claimed to have Etan, who demanded money, who hung up mid-sentence. Detectives learned to treat these with a mix of skepticism and caution. Any real lead, however unlikely, had to be chased down. The press still followed the case, but the coverage shifted. Etan's face would appear alongside stories about other missing children, or in broader pieces about child safety. His image was becoming part of a growing conversation, one that extended beyond SoHo, beyond New York, into a national awareness that cases like his could happen anywhere. Yet, for all the talk of policy changes and public awareness, nothing could change the central fact. The Patz family was still living without answers. Every morning began with the same absence. Every night ended with the same unanswered question. And in the heavy summer air, that question seemed to echo louder than ever. If Etan was out there, why had no one seen him? By the time September rolled around, the Patz case had become a fixture in the NYPD's active files. Not closed, not cold, but stuck in the kind of limbo that frustrates even the most seasoned detectives. Leads still arrived, but most were weak echoes of tips they'd already run down. Then, in the shifting paperwork of the case file, a name began to surface more than once. It didn't belong to a neighbor or a friend, but to a man with a documented history of inappropriate behavior toward children. He had been questioned in other cases, sometimes as a suspect, sometimes as a witness. Nothing had ever stuck, but the pattern was there, a thread worth pulling. Detectives didn't rush in with handcuffs. They knew better. Cases like this required patience, to observe, to cross-check, to see if the suspect's movements could be aligned with the morning of May 25th. They dug into his background, where he lived, where he worked, who he knew in the SoHo area. The deeper they went, the more the coincidences piled up. Meanwhile, Stan and Julie were marking their first autumn without Etan. The school year began again, a painful reminder of the routines that had once been so ordinary. Seeing other children in first-grade lines, wearing backpacks too big for their frames, was enough to make Julie turn away. Stan found himself avoiding the bus stop entirely. The neighborhood was quieter now, the summer haze replaced by the crisp air of fall. But beneath the surface, the tension hadn't eased. Parents were still holding their children's hands a little tighter, still looking twice at unfamiliar faces on the block. The idea of safety had been dented, maybe permanently. The press still circled, though not with the same constant presence as in the early weeks. Etan's case would reappear in headlines when there was something new. A citywide safety initiative, a missing child's awareness event, and then fade again. For Stan and Julie, each lull in coverage felt like another kind of loss. Without the spotlight, the search risked slipping into the shadows. Detectives were careful about what they shared with the family. They couldn't name the man they were looking into, not yet, not without more. But the quiet uptick in their visits and the slightly sharper focus of their questions made it clear. Someone, somewhere, was on their radar. For the first time in months, there was a glimmer of something that felt like forward motion. Not hope, not yet, but movement. And in a case where every unanswered question had felt like a dead end, movement was its own kind of lifeline. By late fall, the name in the case file was no longer just a name. It was a person detectives were actively shadowing. They didn't announce it, not to the press, and not even fully to Stan and Julie. But the energy around the investigation had shifted. The man they were watching was not a stranger to law enforcement. He had a history that made detectives uneasy. Prior allegations involving children, run-ins with the law that never quite resulted in convictions. He was the kind of figure who often appeared in missing child cases. Someone who moved through neighborhoods without drawing much attention, yet had a pattern of behavior that seemed to leave traces in multiple jurisdictions. Detectives began mapping his habits, where he worked, the routes he took, who he spent time with. They spoke quietly to people who knew him, collecting fragments of detail, things that might seem insignificant on their own but could gain weight when stitched together. Each piece of information was fed into a growing timeline, an attempt to answer one question. Could he have been in SoHo on the morning of May 25, 1979? And if so, could he have crossed paths with a 6-year-old boy walking to the bus stop for the first time on his own? While the detectives built their case in careful increments, Stan and Julie lived in a state of partial awareness. They sensed something was happening, but the absence of concrete details left them in a familiar limbo, waiting, hoping, fearing. They knew enough about investigations to understand that not every promising lead ended in an arrest. The press, largely unaware of this quiet focus on a suspect, continued to treat the case as one of New York's lingering mysteries. Feature articles would occasionally revisit Etan's story, often paired with larger conversations about missing children and urban safety. His photo, that bright-eyed portrait, had become almost symbolic, an image that represented something bigger than one boy. In the loft, life took on the strange rhythm of people living alongside an unresolved tragedy. The daycare Julie once ran was gone. Ari, still just a toddler when Etan disappeared, was growing up with the investigation as a constant backdrop. Shira was old enough now to feel the absence in sharper terms, the questions without answers. And still, the detectives kept watching the man in their sights. They knew that in cases like this, time was a double-edged sword. It could erode evidence, but it could also loosen a suspect's guard. They weren't ready to move. Not yet, but they were getting closer. Closer to the moment when the shadow in the file might have to step into the light. Winter settled over New York, and with it came the slower, more deliberate pace that often follows the first rush of an investigation. Snow softened the hard edges of the streets, but nothing could blunt the reality inside the Patz loft. Etan was still gone, and the case was still unresolved. The man under quiet scrutiny remained a presence in the detective's notes. His name would resurface again and again, sometimes through a new piece of information, sometimes because another lead brought them back to him by process of elimination. He was never far from the edges of the case file. But cases like this rarely move in straight lines. Progress came in fits. An interview that yielded a new detail, a scrap of information from another jurisdiction, a witness willing to revisit their statement after months of silence. Each time, the investigators would lean in, only to find the trail bending away again. For Stan and Julie, time had become elastic. Days could drag endlessly, but months seemed to vanish in an instant. They learned to live in cycles. Bursts of activity when something new stirred in the case, followed by long stretches of quiet when it felt like the world had moved on. The suspect, whose name they still didn't know, became almost a phantom in their minds. They understood, from hints in conversation, that someone was being looked at seriously. But without specifics, their imaginations filled in the gaps, sometimes too vividly. Public attention had shifted to other stories, other crises. Yet Etan's image still appeared from time to time, in television retrospectives about the city's unsolved cases, in community events about child safety. His face had become part of a larger cultural memory, one of those photographs that people recognized even if they didn't remember the details of the case. The neighborhood had changed too. SoHo was evolving, more galleries, more boutiques, fewer of the raw, half-industrial spaces that had defined it in the late 70s. New residents moved in without knowing the full history of Prince Street. For them, Etan's name was a story told over coffee or at a community meeting, something that had happened back then. But for Stan and Julie, there was no back then. The day Etan vanished was still here, still present, still shaping every choice they made. And in the detective's office, the shadow in the file, the man who had drawn their attention, was still there too, waiting, watching, and perhaps somewhere remembering. The turn into the 1980s brought no answers, but it brought change. New York was evolving, and so was the conversation around missing children. Etan Patz's disappearance had struck a chord far beyond SoHo, and advocacy groups were beginning to channel that shock into action. National organizations emerged with a mission to centralize the search for missing kids. For the first time, information could be shared quickly across states, photographs could be distributed beyond local jurisdictions, and cases like Etan's could stay in the public consciousness long after the initial search. His face was among the first to appear in a now familiar setting, printed on the side of a milk carton, staring out from breakfast tables across America. The idea was simple but powerful: turn an everyday object into a nationwide missing person bulletin. Millions saw his portrait without ever having set foot in New York. For Stan and Julie, these developments were bittersweet. They knew the exposure could help, but it was a jarring experience to walk into a supermarket and see their son's face beside strangers' children, all reduced to lines of description and a plea for information. It was a reminder that Etan was no longer just their son. He had become a symbol. The investigation, meanwhile, never fully stopped. Detectives changed, units were reassigned, but the case file stayed active. The man they had quietly focused on remained in the picture. He surfaced in police conversations from time to time, a potential lead here, a new report there, but he never slipped fully into their grasp. It was as if he existed just beyond the edge of the evidence, close enough to suspect, too far to charge. For the Patz family, life moved forward in fragments. Birthdays passed. The city's skyline shifted. Ari grew from toddler to boy. Shira entered her teenage years. But Etan's absence was constant, a missing place at the table that never stopped being noticed. Public memory is a strange thing. In some parts of the country, people knew Etan only as the boy on the milk carton. In SoHo, his name still carried a kind of weight, a story that locals told to new arrivals, part cautionary tale, part neighborhood lore. And for those who had been there that spring morning in 1979, it was something else entirely. An open wound that time hadn't closed. The case had already lasted longer than anyone expected. And yet, for the detectives who still carried it, there was a stubbornness in the work. This wasn't a case they could set down. It was one they'd carry until they found the answer, or until the man in the shadows finally made a mistake. By the middle of the decade, the Patz case had lived in the NYPD's active files for 6 years. In police terms, that's a lifetime, long enough for entire squads to cycle through, for case notes to change hands more than once, for memories to fade. But in 1985, a small shift began. A new wave of detectives was assigned to the case, bringing with them a mix of fresh energy and the benefit of hindsight. They read the file with a different perspective, not as officers reacting in the chaos of a disappearance, but as investigators piecing together a story from the distance of time. Technology was beginning to change the way missing persons were tracked. Databases that could link information between states were still in their infancy, but they offered something that hadn't existed in 1979. The ability to cross-reference names, descriptions, and incidents across multiple jurisdictions without relying solely on phone calls and paper files. One name kept surfacing in those cross-references, the same man who had been quietly shadowed in the months after Etan vanished. His record hadn't improved. In fact, in some ways, it had grown darker. Allegations in other cases, contacts with children that raised suspicion, incidents that never quite resulted in charges. It was enough to make the investigators wonder whether they were looking at the same predator they'd considered years before. The trouble was the same as it had always been. Suspicion wasn't evidence. The gaps between what they believed and what they could prove were still wide enough to drive the case into a standstill if they moved too soon. For Stan and Julie, the mid-1980s brought a different kind of attention. The growing national movement for missing children often invited them to speak, at conferences, on television panels, at community events. They hadn't set out to be advocates, but the role found them. Each time they told Etan's story, it kept him present in the public mind. The milk carton campaign continued. Now, it wasn't just a photograph, it was an icon of the cause. For many families, it was a sign that their missing child hadn't been forgotten. For the Patzes, it was both comfort and torment. In SoHo, the neighborhood had changed so much that new residents sometimes had no idea why Etan's name was familiar. The lofts were being renovated, boutiques were replacing warehouses, and the gritty, close-knit feel of the late 70s was giving way to something sleeker and less personal. But in the NYPD's offices, and in the minds of a handful of determined detectives, Etan's case wasn't fading. The suspect who had once been just a shadow was now more defined, his pattern more visible. The question was whether that definition would be enough to bring him into the light. By the end of the 1980s, the Patz case had lived in the public imagination for a decade, long enough for it to have shifted from breaking news to a kind of urban legend. But inside police circles, and for a handful of prosecutors, it was still alive, still unsolved, and still personal. One of those prosecutors was a young assistant U.S. attorney named Stuart Bois. He wasn't part of the original investigation, but when the case crossed his desk, he approached it with the zeal of someone who hadn't already lived through its disappointments. Where some saw an exhausted file, Bois saw possibilities. The suspect, the same man who had been orbiting the case since the early months, was still out there, still leaving behind troubling signs in other incidents. He had never been charged in Etan's disappearance, but his history suggested a pattern. Bois knew he couldn't arrest him for what happened in 1979 without direct evidence. But he began to think about other ways to bring him into a courtroom. Meanwhile, Stan and Julie marked Etan's 17th birthday without him. By now, Ari was old enough to remember his brother clearly, Shira was grown, and the family's grief had evolved into something quieter but no less sharp. They still spoke publicly when asked, often at missing children's events or in interviews marking anniversaries, but their lives were no longer dominated by media appearances. The neighborhood where Etan vanished was almost unrecognizable. The old bodega near the bus stop had closed. Loft spaces were being marketed to a new wave of residents who wanted Soho's cachet but not its rough edges. For many, the block was just another fashionable corner of Lower Manhattan. In the early 1990s, Bois made his move. He worked to have himself sworn in as a deputy prosecutor in another jurisdiction, one where the suspect was facing unrelated charges. His plan was unconventional. Prosecute the man on a separate case, not because it would solve Etan's disappearance, but because it might bring pressure, information, and leverage. It was a gamble, and it was rare for a prosecutor to tie his work so publicly to a case that was still technically unsolved. But Bois seemed to thrive on the risk. He knew that waiting for a perfect break in a 13-year-old investigation wasn't a strategy. It was a slow surrender. The Patz family didn't yet know exactly where this was headed. But for the first time in years, there was a sense that someone in authority was willing to move the wheel forward, even if it meant taking a path that had never been tried before. And in a case that had been defined by its stalls and silences, that willingness to act felt like its own kind of hope. The suspect's name had been spoken quietly in police briefings for years, but now it was being written in a prosecutor's notebooks. Stuart Bois wasn't content to wait for the kind of miracle evidence that rarely appears in cases this old. His strategy was to close the distance, to get close enough to the man to learn more than the paper record could tell. By becoming a deputy prosecutor in another jurisdiction, Bois was able to work on a separate case against the suspect. It was an unusual maneuver, almost surgical in its precision. He couldn't touch the Patz case directly, but he could still hold the man accountable for other alleged crimes. And in doing so, he could watch him, question him, push him. The suspect was brought into court on these unrelated charges, and the sight of him in that setting was a jolt for those who had spent years imagining him only as a name in a file. There was nothing obviously monstrous in his appearance. No dark, cinematic menace. That was part of what made him dangerous. The legal proceedings didn't produce the confession Bois hoped for, but they did something else. They put the suspect back under a spotlight. Media outlets covering the unrelated case began to revisit his possible link to Etan's disappearance. Old headlines were dusted off, and Etan's photograph appeared on television screens again. For Stan and Julie, it was another complicated moment. Public attention was a double-edged sword. Could bring in new tips, new energy. But it could also reopen wounds and invite the kind of speculation that had always trailed the case. Still, they knew the alternative silence was worse. Bois' approach also changed the internal dynamics of the investigation. Detectives who had quietly kept the suspect on their mental list now saw a federal prosecutor willing to invest time, risk, and reputation to keep him in view. It gave the case a renewed legitimacy inside law enforcement circles. And it sent a message to the suspect. The years hadn't made anyone forget. Whether he understood it or not, he was no longer just a name in a file. He was a man being followed not only by a prosecutor, but by the weight of a story the city, and now the country, still carried. The sight of the suspect in court, even for charges unrelated to Etan's disappearance, had a way of waking the story back up. Newspapers ran sidebars linking his name to the 1979 case. Television producers began calling the Patz family again, asking for interviews. For Stan and Julie, the requests brought a familiar tension. They had learned long ago that media attention could vanish as quickly as it arrived, and that when it was gone, so were many of the leads. So they agreed to speak, not to relive the pain for its own sake, but to remind the public that Etan's face wasn't just a symbol. He was a boy who had lived, laughed, and been loved, and who had been missing for far too long. The interviews felt different this time. In the early days, the questions had been urgent. What happened? How can people help? Now, the questions were more reflective. How have you lived without answers for this long? What would justice look like now? Meanwhile, Prosecutor Stuart Bois was still at work, probing the suspect in court, looking for inconsistencies, watching for the small slips that can matter more than the big statements. His efforts didn't yield a confession, but they did create a new record, testimony, documents, and observations that could be built upon later. The suspect, for his part, seemed to understand that his past was not staying in the past. Even outside the courthouse, reporters occasionally asked him about Etan Patz. He denied involvement, but the association was now part of his public identity, whether he liked it or not. This renewed attention spilled into the larger conversation about missing children. By the mid-1990s, advocacy groups had the tools to distribute alerts faster than ever before. New legislation was making it harder for offenders to move between jurisdictions unnoticed. And Etan's name was often invoked in those discussions, a reminder of what could happen when the system had too few safeguards. For Stan and Julie, the publicity had one more, quieter effect. It stirred up the network of people who had been part of the search from the beginning. Old neighbors called to check in. Former investigators, now retired, reached out to say they were still following the case. Even in a city known for its short memory, there were people who hadn't let it go. But Bois knew that momentum was fragile. Without new evidence, the suspect could slip back into the shadows. The challenge was finding a way to keep him in the light and to keep Etan's story from fading with him. The late 1990s came and went without a dramatic turn. After the courtroom appearances tied to the unrelated charges, the suspect receded from the headlines. For the public, the Patz case slid back into that shadowed space reserved for unresolved stories, remembered but not actively followed. For Stan and Julie, there was no such distance. They lived with the absence every day, whether or not the cameras were there. Their advocacy work continued, speaking engagements, media appearances around anniversaries, meetings with lawmakers pushing for stronger protections for children. They did it partly for Etan, partly for the other families they met who were enduring the same endless limbo. Inside law enforcement, the case was still open. Detectives came and went, but the file was never closed, and the suspect's name never disappeared from it. Those who worked the case knew his history, the patterns of behavior, the prior allegations, but the gap between suspicion and evidence was still wide. Then, in the early 2000s, a quiet shift began. A new team of investigators took another pass through the file. By now, advances in forensics and database searches meant they could cross-check old information in ways that hadn't been possible 20 years earlier. Interviews could be revisited, timelines re-verified, witnesses recontacted with fresh questions. And the suspect? He was still alive, still leaving traces, interactions, statements, movements that could be watched. His name wasn't just a dusty note in an old report. It was an active point of interest. For the Patz family, the news that the case was being looked at again stirred something they hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't quite hope, they had learned to guard themselves against that, but it was movement. After years of quiet, someone was pulling the thread again. Outside the family, most people still thought of Etan as the boy on the milk carton, frozen in 1979, his face unchanged by time. But for those inside the investigation, the focus was on the present. Watching a man who had spent decades avoiding consequences and considering whether, at last, there was a way to close the gap between what they believed and what they could prove. By the early 2010s, the Patz case had lived in the files of the NYPD for more than 3 decades. But the passage of time hadn't dulled the determination of a new wave of investigators assigned to it. They approached the file not as a relic, but as a puzzle that could still be solved, if they could find the right pressure points. The suspect, the man whose name had appeared in police notes since 1979, was still the center of that puzzle. He had lived a fractured life since the early days of the investigation, drifting between jobs, leaving behind incidents that hinted at a darker history, though none had ever led to a conviction for Etan's disappearance. Detectives began the slow work of rebuilding the case from the ground up. They re-interviewed witnesses who had seen the suspect in the neighborhood around the time Etan vanished. They tracked down former acquaintances, co-workers, and even family members. In conversations that sometimes began politely and ended in unease, they tested old alibis, asked about past behaviors, and probed for moments of inconsistency. The strategy was deliberate. Rather than rushing to confront the suspect, they wanted to surround him with a web of corroborated details, a structure strong enough to hold up in court. This meant layering decades-old statements with fresh ones, looking for the places where his own words had shifted over time. Meanwhile, the Patz family learned of the renewed activity in cautious fragments. They had lived through too many false starts to treat every new surge of investigative energy as a breakthrough. Still, when they saw the quiet but steady pattern of police visits, they knew something was building. The city had changed beyond recognition since 1979. SoHo was now an upscale district of polished storefronts and high-end lofts. But the corner where Etan was last seen remained, for those who remembered, a ghost point on the map, a place where a moment in time had been permanently broken. Inside the NYPD, the tone was shifting. After years of carrying the suspect's name like an unanswered question, investigators began to speak about him in terms of inevitability. The question was no longer whether to approach him, but when and how. They knew they would only get one chance to do it right. It took months of preparation before the moment arrived. Detectives had been circling the suspect for years, but now they were ready to close in, not with a casual interview, but with a coordinated plan designed to strip away decades of distance. They began with the environment. The suspect was approached in a setting they could control, a place where the conversation would be long and uninterrupted. There would be no quick exits, no distractions, no chance for him to disappear back into the haze of unanswered questions. The opening questions were familiar, almost routine, an old case, a few details from the past. But slowly the tempo shifted. Dates were revisited. Alibis were tested. His own prior statements, recorded years apart, were read back to him. Detectives asked about the neighborhood in 1979, the route to the school bus, the faces he might have seen. Then came the direct questions. About Etan. About May 25th. About whether he had ever spoken to or approached a boy matching that description. The suspect's answers were uneven. At times, he denied outright. At others, he hesitated, as though deciding how much to say. Detectives watched every pause, every shift in tone. They knew that, after 3 decades, the words mattered, but the way they were delivered could matter even more. Throughout the interview, there was a sense of history in the room. The voices of past investigators seemed to echo in the questions. The files spread out on the table, the black and white photo of a boy whose smile had outlasted the years. When the session ended, they didn't yet have a confession. But they had something else. Cracks in the wall. Places where his story no longer lined up. Moments where the certainty in his voice faltered. And sometimes, in long cases, it's those small shifts, not a single dramatic revelation, that tipped the balance toward resolution. Outside, the city moved as it always had, unaware that inside a quiet room, after decades of waiting, the Patz case had just taken its first real step toward an ending. In the weeks after that pivotal interview, the cracks in the suspect's story became the focus of everything. Detectives compared his recent statements against decades-old records, charting each contradiction. They re-interviewed people from his past, showing them transcripts, asking if his new version of events rang true. It was a slow tightening of the net, not a cinematic sprint, but a deliberate constriction. And then, one day, the break came. During a follow-up conversation, with investigators pressing in on the inconsistencies, the suspect's tone shifted. The denials softened. He began speaking less in absolutes and more in what-ifs, edging closer to the truth he had avoided for more than 30 years. Then, in a halting, fractured admission, He described luring a boy who matched Etan's description. It wasn't a polished confession, and parts were still evasive, but it was enough to bring the case into the open. News broke quickly. The story that had been quiet for decades was suddenly everywhere again. Etan's face back on television, his name on front pages. For many, it was the first time they realized the case had never truly been solved. For others, it was the end to a question they had carried since 1979. The courtroom was packed for the trial. Stan and Julie sat together, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. They had lived with this story for so long that seeing the suspect in a defendant's chair felt almost unreal. Witnesses testified, old evidence was reviewed, and the jury was walked through the decades of investigation. The false leads, the persistence, the small moments that finally broke the silence. The verdict came after careful deliberation. Guilty. The man who had hovered on the edges of the Patz case for most of his adult life was now convicted in connection with it. For the Patz family, it was not closure, the word never quite fit. Etan was still gone, and no sentence could return him. But it was resolution. The questions that had hung in the air for so long finally had an answer, and the person responsible would never again walk the streets as a free man. When the judge pronounced the sentence, the courtroom was still. It was a moment measured not in triumph, but in the heavy relief of something long overdue. Outside, the city moved on as it always had. But for Stan and Julie, the long road had reached its end. They had carried their son's story across decades, through grief, through doubt, through the endless grind of waiting. And now, at last, they could set it down.